Nobody gives mercy better than the person who realizes and is convinced that they desperately need that same mercy themselves.
This is Mission 66, brought to you by TWR and the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Luis Sayao. Today, we're stepping into 2 Samuel, offering timeless lessons of repentance, justice, mercy, and relying on God's guidance. You can follow along with your downloadable study guide at mission66.org. Here's John Matthews with Esther Sisulu to guide our study.
Our journey through the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel continues here on Mission 66. Thank you so much for joining us, friends. Now, it is true of us as mankind that often when we've messed up, when we've made mistakes, we may try to justify our actions by comforting ourselves and saying, well, nobody's perfect, right? And in the instance that adultery was committed, we may point to the example of David and Bathsheba and how God forgave David. Well, in today's episode, we'll see that forgiveness is one thing, but consequences are something else entirely. So here is our teacher, John Matthews, who will help us understand chapter 13 with the theme, The Wages of Sin.
Thanks so much, Esther. Great to be with you again, and a very warm welcome to you all listening to this latest episode of Mission 66, wherever it is that you join us from today, and whatever your situation, it is so good to be with you and to have your company today. Thank you for being with us. And yeah, it's true, as Esther was alluding to there, and actually in the words of Isaiah, we all have sinned and gone astray. And this was the case even with, the man described as being somebody after God's own heart. We're talking, of course, about Israel's King David, who was the psalmist of Israel, who wrote many of the psalms praising God with his words and the brilliance of his musical skills on his harp. Killed a giant, didn't he? But not able to kill his base desires. And so he gazed upon the body of another man's wife and took her. And when she became pregnant, David tries to cover that up by making the husband, Uriah the Hittite, believe that the child would be his, but Uriah wouldn't visit his wife out of this loyal heart devotion to duty to David. And so David then commits a more shameful act again by arranging for the death of Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, in battle. And in chapter 12, which was the last episode, David is rebuked by the prophet Nathan because of what he's done. And to his credit, David admits the sin and is forgiven by God, which meant he wouldn't have to die for what he had done, but nonetheless, there were consequences, and those consequences to David's sin begin to surface. And one of those consequences that the Lord pronounced against David was that evil was going to raise up within the very walls of his own house. And chapter 13 tells us about such an incident. So let's read about this in verse 1. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, loved her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. Now Amnon was the oldest of David's sons, and Tamar was the only daughter that we know about. There may have been others. But here is Amnon lusting after his half-sister, similarly to the way that David had lusted after the wife of Uriah. And verse 3 says, But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very crafty man. And he said to him, O son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me? And Amnon said to him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Now, Jonadab would have been a cousin to Amnon, but not by blood. You see, David's multiple wives created this complex, confused family where brothers didn't really consider the boys born of other women to be true brothers. So neither Jonadab nor Amnon feel any familial loyalty to Tamar or indeed to Absalom. And so here in verse 5, they hatch a plot. Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." And then David sent home to Tamar, saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, where he was lying down, and she took dough and kneaded it, and made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Send out everyone from me." So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber, that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon, her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said, "Come, lie with me, my sister." And she answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. So here the scandal goes on right under David's nose. It looks like Tamar would have agreed to become a wife to Amnon. She may have even felt attraction to him, but she had enough of a sense of decency to say to him, "You can have me, just ask permission." She wanted to do things the right way, but Amnon had his own way. And verse 15 says, "Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, 'Get up, go.' But she said to him, 'No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me.' But he would not listen to her. And he called the young man who served him and said, 'Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her.' Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away crying aloud as she went." And doesn't it often happen when there is sin, the desire that Amnon had for her turned to disgust and hatred? Once Amnon had so-called satisfied his lust, the demon in him rears its head. And verse 20 says that Tamar's brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Now, hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar lived a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, For Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. And so we see David starting to feel the effects of the consequences of his own sin. And those of us who are parents know that sometimes our children imitate the kinds of attitudes and behaviours that we ourselves are most guilty of. But 2 years later, David was about to feel the sting of another part of those consequences that the prophet Nathan had pronounced against him, that the sword would never depart from his house. This is verse 23. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. And Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king and said, "Behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." But the king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you." But he pressed him, but he would not go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." And the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Then Absalom commanded his servants, "Mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine. And when I say to you, 'Strike Amnon,' then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. So Absalom would not kill his brother personally, but cowardly he commands his servants to carry out his skullduggery, I suppose you could call it, similarly to the way David had done with Uriah. The murderous intent, however, was Absalom's, and intent is what really makes the crime. And here in verse 30 it says, "While they were on their way, news came to David, 'Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left.' Then the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth. And all his servants who were standing by tore their garments. But Jonadab, the son of Shimea, David's brother, said, 'Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar.'" Notice how Jonadab stands aloof here when he was involved in the planning of the situation that led to the rape of Tamar. Verse 34 says, "But Absalom fled, and the young man who kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. And Jonadab said to the king, 'Behold, the king's sons have come, as your servant said, so it has come about.' And as soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. And the king also and all his servants wept very bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son day after day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and was there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom, because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. So here's David weeping bitter tears over the consequences that have come into his house since the day that he himself committed adultery and murder. But he's also being bereaved of his son Absalom, who's run away from home because of what he's done. We've actually not heard the last of Absalom, but here we see David reaping the consequences of his actions.
This is Mission 66. I'm Esther, here with our teacher, John Matthews. And real quick, before we head into our question and answer session, here's a question for you, friend. Are you following us on Facebook and on Instagram? Well, this is how you can be a part of the Mission 66 community. By typing in Mission 66 on Facebook and on Instagram, you can like the page, leave a comment or a question on today's episode or any episode, in fact, that sparked your interest. And you can then be a part of the Mission 66 community, having wonderful discussions about what we're learning in the Bible. Well, John, let me start off with this first question. You know, we use the word love quite a lot in our day and age, but I know that it seems that there are varying definitions of this word.
Yeah, and the word love has different meanings. You're right. In our modern day, the word is usually connected, isn't it, to an emotional feeling. But the ancient Greeks had at least 6 words for love, and they had a different meaning. So you have eros, philia, philosia, storg, xenia, and agape. So eros was the sexual kind and probably the basest meaning of love. Then you had philia, which was this affectionate regard for another, especially between equals, such as between brothers, or indeed the kind of friendship that David had with Saul's son Jonathan. The name Philadelphia, for example, means the city of brotherly love. Storge was the kind of love that parents may have for their children and children for their parents. Philosia means self-love in both good and bad senses. It could be like selfish egotism, but it could also be self-respect, which would lead to good behavior and taking care of yourself with good diet and exercise and so on. Xenia is the love that results in hospitality for guests, even strangers. But then comes the highest form of love, and that is agape love, which is the kind of love that God has for man and man for God. And a man with agape love will love God first and his neighbor as himself. Another word that we use connected to that is altruism, love for the very sake of doing good. And that actually is the kind of love that we like ourselves to receive from others, but sometimes we find it really hard to demonstrate it ourselves. And it should be said that one who really loves holistically often exhibits some, or indeed all of these different kinds of love, not just the one. But look, let's take a closer look at the text here and what Amnon felt and described in the passage as love was never really a full love. He was only interested in the carnality of Eros, and nothing else. Never once did Amnon consider Tamar's well-being. He just saw her as an object to satisfy his immediate desires. And once satisfied, that Eros love quickly dissipated, turning, in fact, to hatred.
That is quite a scary display, isn't it, John? But, you know, you mentioned this philia, this brotherly love, and storge, right? We see that kind of love as well, which is between parents and children. And if I'm being honest with you, you really don't see much of that in David's family.
Yeah, it's a shrewd observation, Esther, and it may well be because many of David's sons were from different mothers, and so they didn't exhibit much brotherly kindness except when it suited them. You have Amnon here raping his sister, Absalom killing Amnon. And, you know, we see polygamy in the Old Testament. And even though it was tolerated at the time, it creates this strange and deeply complex family dynamics. And we see that at play here, but also it's a result ultimately, isn't it, of sin.
Ooh. The ramifications of sin are sometimes indescribable. And we see it here because after all of this drama with what had happened to Tamar, Absalom decides that he's going to murder his half-brother after doing that, he flees, and then he takes matters into his own hands. And by the end of chapter 13, he escapes to this place called Geshur. So let's give information about what this place is and why he made the choice to go there.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it actually ties back to the broader issue of David's family and his multiple wives, because Geshur is Absalom's maternal homeland on his mother's side. Why was that? Well, that's because Absalom was the son of Maachah, who was the daughter of the king of Geshur. And Geshur was a city in Syria, which was historically known as Aram. Now, David, as part of his international relations or diplomacy, he married this foreign woman, which likely fostered good relations with the Arameans in the region. And so given that context, it's likely that Absalom didn't receive a strong religious or spiritual upbringing. He had strong ties to his mother's side, to his maternal side, and so when trouble arises here, he flees to the safety of his grandparents' home. And so it just reveals a more complex scene involving relationships with people who just didn't know the God of Israel very well at all.
Wow. John, with all of this confusion and all of this tragedy within David's family, what do you think we can conclude from this? I mean, is this as a result of God's punishment, or was David simply just not a good father? Was the fact that his absence could have caused all of this turmoil within his family?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Esther. And yeah, it's messy, isn't it? You know, he's got these multiple wives and children from those marriages. And so he's running a kingdom. And so in a sense, it's impossible time-wise for him to do these things really well. And yet it is often said, and it says in the Bible, that David was a man after God's own heart. Perhaps he wasn't a man after his family's own heart, you know, in terms of the way his priorities work. But look, that said, we usually judge Old Testament figures looking through our lens, don't we, of modern day habits and assumptions. But had we lived, you know, back in David's time amongst his people, I imagine we would probably have had an entirely different reference point or entrance point to our understanding and our way of assessing these things.
So this instance of Amnon and Tamar, look, I think without a doubt, Amnon should have been punished for what he did to Tamar. And Absalom, I suppose, in this context, considering the law, he actually deserved death for murdering his brother. But not only did we see that David didn't quite do much about this apart from getting angry, I think David perhaps might have shown some favoritism towards Absalom. And I think that perhaps might have added fuel to this already raging fire. What do you think?
Yeah, well, look, David goes easy, doesn't he, on Amnon because he's the eldest son, believing that he would be the heir. And this is before Solomon became God's choice for the succession of the throne. And what we will see, though, you know, is that God will undertake to administer divine punishment even in the face of David's poor family management. But, you know, look, if we bring this a little closer to home, it becomes a little more uncomfortable. It certainly does for me, Esther. Yeah, who among us can say that we've run our family affairs really well and consistently so? Who can say that we've always dealt with our children with perfect fairness and equality? Look, sometimes I've been a long, long way short of that. In fact, for that matter, who can say that we ourselves have not done things that are worthy according to the yardstick that we're looking at here at this point in the Old Testament of death and punishment, but yet have experienced mercy and forgiveness and love from God instead? Paul Tripp once said this, didn't he? He said, "No parent gives mercy better than one who is convinced that they desperately need that mercy for themselves." Maybe when we've got a true, honest understanding of our own sin and our own hearts, maybe then we're better equipped to be merciful to similar sins and similar situations in other people, including in our children.
Absolutely true. And I suppose that this is why we should not be quick to judge others.
Completely right. But we yet should be quick to seek God's mercy and forgiveness in Jesus, which, as we often say here on Mission 66, because it is there writ large in the pages of this incredible book, the Bible, because that mercy and that forgiveness in Jesus is available to us for the asking, here, now. But God wants us to ask. He wants us and needs us to see our need of Him, of His forgiveness, of His saving grace, of Him setting us free, to be free people, to be people of peace, to be the people of the potential that He has planted in our lives as human beings.
Well, that is a call from God, calling us to Himself today, dear friend. All you have to do is ask. Thanks, John. This was a good word. Let's segue now into the chapter summary, chapter 13 of 2 Samuel.
Yeah, and Esther, it's an episode that really starts to highlight the consequences of sin. And we see those consequences in King David's family. And, despite him being a man after God's own heart, his moral failures, adultery and murder, they set this destructive pattern for his children. Amnon's lust-driven actions toward his sister Tamar, coupled with David's inaction, lead to family strife. Amnon's subsequent murder by his own brother Absalom illustrate the ripple effects of sin and poor leadership, and we see that Amnon's selfish, flesh-driven actions, well, they lacked love and real concern for Tamar. The episode also looks at the complexity of David's polygamous family, strained sibling relationships. Absalom flees to Geshur, back to his mother's homeland. And, ultimately, I think the narrative reminds us of the importance of humble repentance and just asking God for His mercy, because He can renew. He doesn't hold the past against us. He sees our heart's desire. And striving as we must to lead our own families with justice and love, but understanding and empathy, understanding what our hearts are really like when we deal with our families and with our own children and siblings and whatever it may be, our parents. We need to acknowledge our own imperfections in order to be gracious and compassionate about the perfections in others.
Well, this has been a wonderful time spent in the transformative Word of God, the Bible, and I hope you've enjoyed yourself with myself, Esther, and our teacher, John Matthews. Hey, we'll be waiting for you next time as we take you further into 2 Samuel, and we're looking at the life of Israel's King David. Now, friend, just in case you didn't know, Mission 66 is heard in several languages all around the world, and we're so grateful for this opportunity to share this truth of Jesus Christ to the people in the world. And so we truly are dependent on your prayers and your financial support to continue this ministry globally. And if it's on your heart to give a gift to this ministry, please do visit mission66.org so that we can continue, and we're spurred on to do this work for the glory of God. So visit mission66.org. Until next time, God bless you and goodbye.
Has God used today's program in your life? Then you'll want to receive the free study guide that's waiting for you on our website. You can get it right away by downloading it at mission66.org. At mission66.org, you can also leave a comment or make a donation to help this listener-supported ministry. When you give, you're helping listeners experience solid Bible teaching in many languages in some of the most spiritually resistant places in the world. Thank you for helping at mission66.org. Mission 66 is a ministry of Transworld Radio.